From the New Arts and Media Studios in River West, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. We're going to make this half hour together episode 2 of my as yet untitled memoir. We did part 1 last week. The idea, and it's mostly for my 2 grown children, and you can listen along if you want to, if it turns out to be valuable for any reason. The idea is to do an extemporaneous podcast memoir rather than in book form. So that's the plan. Well, there is no plan. Let me correct that. We're going to see if this works. If it's something that I want to do, if it's something you want to hear, if it's something I feel is valuable for my 2 grown children, then I'll continue. So this might be a 2-part series. It might be a 10-part series. It might be a 100-part series. I don't know. Whatever happens, happens. And at some point, I'll give it a title. So this is my memoir. One thing I want to make clear here at the outset, I've talked about this on other shows, but just in case there's any confusion, let's be real clear about it. I am Peter Donalds. That's my name. My alias, my radio moniker, is Charles Purcell. A few years ago, when I really established all the radio and podcast work I was doing and started creating a lot of radio theater and political commentary and various podcast titles, created the website, I thought, okay, I can't do this under my own name because I'm already established as a singer and musician. And I already have a music website, and I have potential clientele out there. I've got my contact information. I want people to reach out and hire me as a musician. That's my profession. And the last thing I want is for those people to Google up my name and find all of this crazy radio and podcasting stuff, especially the really sort of extreme political commentary that I have. That doesn't work. So I've worked in radio before. Half the people you hear on the radio are not using their own names. I thought, well, I'll just come up with a new name. So that's the story there, if there was any confusion. I am Peter Donalds. I am Charles Purcell. They're the same person. Charles Purcell, I got that name from my grandfather. His name was Charles Nelson, but his father's name was Nels Purcell. And when he immigrated from Sweden, you know how that worked in the days. You wind up with an American name for some reason. At Ellis Island, they just sort of said, okay, well, you're Nelson now. It was one of those deals. So, and I don't remember his father's name. Maybe that was Charles also. I'd have to look back into the family archives. So I went back to the Purcell name, and it took my grandfather's name, Charles, so that's where Charles Purcell came from. All right, so there you go. There's that story. In episode 1, talked a little bit about my parents, the fact that they were older, and I was one of the younger of many siblings. So even though I was born in 1958, it kind of felt more like 1938. The influence that my parents brought along was very much wartime, post-war kind of a motif. Lyons, Wisconsin is a little spit of a town between Lake Geneva and Burlington, Wisconsin. That's Walworth County, about 45 minutes southwest of the big city of Milwaukee, and not too far from the Illinois border. Norman Rockwell would have felt very much at home there in Lyons with my parents and household and furnishings and the whole bit. Looked like we dropped right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. By the time I came along, my parents and their kids, my older brothers and sisters, were pretty well established. Had a nice little house, a red brick 2-story. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, I guess. But since there were so many kids, they had to they were sharing. Big old yard, which plays into some of my earliest memories as a very small child. And looking back, kind of conflicting images of immense privilege. You know, nice house, nice yard, cherry trees, apple trees, kind of on the edge of town. So our yard didn't border with the next neighbor. It bordered expansive fields, pasture land and farmland. And it was kind of great. So even though we were town kids, if you just take a right instead of a left out the front door, it was wild country. So it felt like, and in retrospect even, like incredible privilege. But when I think about it, you know, we never had anything new or exciting as far as appliances in the house or furniture, or my dad never bought a new car. It took many years to realize we were lower middle class. We were sort of getting by. But we were fine. So yeah, kind of this mixed picture of struggling lower middle class, but immense privilege. Small town, Walworth County, Wisconsin. So 100% white, of course. I had no exposure at any time until years later to anyone other than the white Christian paradigm. And 1958 is an interesting year to come into the world because in many ways it was the last page of that familiar old book in America. I mean, just absolute white privilege, comfort, conformity, Dwight Eisenhower, howdy doody. Because right at that time, Chuck Berry and Little Richard are having their way on the rock and roll charts. And if you know anything at all about music history, that was just a seminal moment. I mean, it was huge. It was screeching on the brakes of popular culture, getting out of the car and getting into a brand new car and peeling out. I mean, you cannot underestimate the power of Chuck Berry and Little Richard and rock and roll. You just can't. On the entire trajectory of the United States. So that's 1958. I feel like I was really born at the end of one era and the beginning of another. 1958 is the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. It's really starting to hit the fan. What an incredible time that was. A short 10 years later is 1968, when everything is just up for grabs. I mean, everything is up for grabs in 1968. Just a short 10 years later. So, what an interesting time to enter the world. My earliest memories are of the bucolic variety, of the Norman Rockwell variety. The early fantasies of childhood, Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, tooth fairies and all of that. I was trying to think of my first actual memory, and I think it might be a trip to my grandparents' house. Both of my dad's parents were still alive at that time. And after a long car trip, we go into the house, which I remember I can still smell to this day, just reeked of pipe tobacco. Really unpleasant, because there was kind of a mix of Ben Gay in there too. My grandmother was bedridden. So, yeah, pipe tobacco and Ben Gay, that was my grandparents' house. But they brought me in, I remember, and put me in a crib. And as I look back, this is my first conscious memory. I remember thinking, what the hell, man? Why'd they put me in a crib? I'm too big for a crib. What is this? I was mortified. I was angry. But now you need a nap. And here's where you can take a nap. And it was a damn crib. Come on, Mom and Dad, what are you doing? My grandmother scared the hell out of me because she was very old and she was frail and she was in bed and, scary for a little kid. Just I don't know. That's natural, right? Was I a bad seed because I was repulsed by this sight and these smells? Or was that a natural reaction? And she did something that was, to this day, I'm not quite sure what was happening. I think maybe she was just trying to assist in her circulation. But as she laid in bed, kind of propped up on a pillow a little bit, she would raise her right arm and it would just hang there, suspended in air, just straight up, bent at the wrist, her hand just sort of dropping down. But from the shoulder on up, straight elbow, she would sit there for what seemed like hours. I don't know how long this would last, but this is my first memory of my grandmother, that her arm would be raised up straight, vertically, with the relaxed wrist. I don't know what was going on there, but it scared the hell out of me. Oh, man, I did not like those trips up to Tomahawk, Wisconsin, to the old homestead. No, it's beautiful up there. It's really nice country. Up north, we call it. Anything north of Madison is up north to those of us in southeastern Wisconsin. That's where you go. That's where you go to relax, where you go to vacation, where you go to fish, where you go to visit grandparents. You go up north. Speaking of Wisconsin, I was born into the greatest state in the Union. Wisconsin had a long history of progressive politics. You might be surprised with our current sad state, but it was the birthplace of the Republican Party. Ripon, Wisconsin is where the Republican Party was born. And if you remember, the original Republican Party was badass. They were good folks. It was before the big transition. It was before the big Southern strategy and the 1960s when everything changed and Republicans became the repugnants. No, back in the day, Republicans were sort of revolutionary, salt-of-the-earth, progressive folks. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president. So, yeah, Wisconsin, Ripon, Wisconsin, birthplace of that Republican Party. And then a few years later, in the early 20th century, the birthplace of the Progressive Party, fighting Bob La Follette and all of those guys. And now we're talking real progressives, what we know as progressives today. Social justice warriors. Wisconsin, birthplace and cornerstone, headquarters. So Wisconsin was just the greatest state in the Union. Milwaukee had a whole series, several socialist mayors who built this great legacy to this day. We've got one of the best parks systems in America. Much of the lakefront on Lake Michigan is still public rather than private. All thanks to these really innovative socialist mayors, what they called sewer socialism at the time, because they just wanted to get things right for the people. Things like sewer systems, things like parks, transportation. Milwaukee was unique in America with this long run of socialist mayors that went right up until, well, about that time. I think the last socialist mayor left office in the early 60s. I'd have to look back at my history on that. So I always considered myself a pretty lucky guy that I was born where I was when I was. By the time I was really conscious of what was going on, I could see pretty clearly what the gender roles were in my family. My mother was the downtrodden housewife and appeared pretty resentful about it. From my very earliest memories, she wasn't warm, loving, really. She was mostly just frazzled and hardworking all the time, and she always had a headache or a stomach ache, and she was always popping Alka-Seltzer or Bayer aspirin and shouting at the kids to do their chores. So as much as I'd love to report a very happy and loving relationship with my mom, I wish I could, but I can't. I imagine she was doing her best, but she didn't seem real happy much of the time. My dad was the manager of the small grocery store in town, Apple Grocery Store. Mr. Apple owned the place. The Apple family was powerful in this little town. And if I'm remembering correctly, if my brothers and sisters are listening to this, which I hope actually they're not, I'd prefer that they don't. But if they are, they're going to have all sorts of corrections. I'm just operating on my best memory. Pretty sure he managed the meat market section of the grocery store. He was the meat manager. My first memories of that store, Apple's, a wooden floor, right, with sawdust on the floor. And, of course, everybody smoking everywhere. This was central to my earliest memories. Everybody had a butt going. I mean, everybody. And people are smoking in the stores. These are the days when you just flicked your ashes on the floor wherever you were. That was just kind of acceptable. It's so odd to think about it. I mean, I was born into a film noir movie. Maybe that's why I like film noir so much. Maybe it's a natal kind of a thing. Because I love film noir movies. But yeah, they're just flicking their ashes around. They're smoking in the car. They're smoking in the grocery store. They're smoking in church. Well, they're not smoking in church. And when you're finished, you just drop it, snuff it with your foot right there on the floor. So there were cigarette butts everywhere. You wouldn't think that this would be such a powerful memory, but yeah, it sort of just defined the world. Both of my parents smoked. It was that damn smoke was always in the air. Every place stunk. Every place smelled like it. God, glad that's over. Lord Jesus. Yeah, both my parents eventually quit, but it wasn't until they hit 60 years old. They smoked all through my childhood. And that's just the way it was. I look back at it now. I look at old movies. And I'm just thinking, man, that room must just smell like hell. And then Humphrey Bogart takes a big old deep drag, and the next thing you know, he's kissing Lauren Bacall. It's like, oh my God, how can you two be kissing each other? Speaking of which, this is speculation, but I have no idea what kind of relationship my parents had. It didn't look good. I don't remember, my dad would give my mom a little kiss when he came in from the end of a day's work. So I guess they did show a little bit of affection, but they weren't real sweet with each other. I didn't see a lot of displays of affection. They had twin beds, like a couple on a sitcom. So I don't know what was going on there. Speaking of sitcoms, I do remember, let's see, what's the first television I remember? Black and white, obviously. Romper Room. And the host of Romper Room was this very kindly lady, young woman who would look through her looking glass, which was really just sort of like the frame of a mirror with nothing in it. But she'd look through, and then she'd say, I see Timmy. And I see Betty, and I see Anne, and just, the big deal, you're sitting at the edge of your seat. Is she going to say, I see Peter today? Oh my God, would that be exciting? Bozo the Clown, Captain Kangaroo. These are the early black and white memories. Big old floor model television set. In those days, of course, it was the biggest piece, one of the biggest pieces of furniture in the home. My grandmother lived with us, my mother's mother, Grandma Nelson. And just like my dad's mother, scared the bejesus out of me. I wanted nothing to do with her. Not the kind of grandmotherly relationship you might hope for, sitting in the lap and getting hugs and kisses and, oh, Grandma. No, it was run when you see her coming. She was just old and wrinkled, and I don't know where I got this notion, but again, I think maybe I just had a little bit of bad seed in me. Why would I have this prejudice? But I did. I don't know where it came from. But I was just scared of her and avoided her at all costs. I was told she had a Swedish accent, but I wouldn't know because I just would avoid her at every turn. The one thing I do know is she had to watch her stories, so that the one television in the house wasn't available for a couple hours in the afternoon. Well, let's go from TV to radio, because that's a very early memory. One of my very first memories is the radio my mother had going while she went about her household chores, especially if it was kitchen work. Anything about preparing meals or putting away groceries or doing the dishes, any of that. That radio was always going. And she was devoted to personalities. Well, two I remember specifically. Paul Harvey, who continued on radio for many, many years afterwards into my adulthood with his, you may remember, The Rest of the Story, where he'd tell some interesting story that had a twist at the end. That was The Rest of the Story. But the one I really remember most of all is Arthur Godfrey, who began his radio career way back in the, 30s, 40s. He was around for a long time. And he had the most soothing, homespun, neighbor over the fence kind of delivery. Just talking about whatever came to mind. And he would be on in the afternoons, probably, I'm guessing, maybe WTMJ out of Milwaukee. I don't know. WTMJ is the big powerhouse that blasts its signal across half the state to this day. Yeah, Arthur Godfrey. And his pleasant chattering, interrupted occasionally by a song, some very sort of harmless pop song from the late 50s, early 60s. Perry Como, Doris Day, that sort of thing. So that displayed my mother's softer side, I thought. I mean, all I've said about her so far has been a little bit harsh. But she did play the piano, and she had a pretty decent record collection, which I got into at a very early age. And she seemed to appreciate softer things. Well, what else can I tell you about those very first days there? I only learned many, many, many years later that my oldest sister, Mary, pretty much raised me my first year. She and her sister, Debbie, my two half-sisters, did not have a good relationship with my mother, their stepmother. And without getting into it, that's not my story to tell. That's Mary's story to tell. But by the time she turned 18, she was pretty much ready to go out on her own. She was happy to leave the household. And that was when I was only about a year old. So I never knew Mary, except for occasional and very occasional visits. I didn't really know my sister Mary at all until I was 30 years old and engaged to be married out in California. And since Mary was the only family nearby, she lived in Southern California, I was in San Francisco, I invited her to the wedding. She was the only family there. And that's when she and I connected. And ever since then, we've been very close. I really love my sister Mary. And she then told me that, yeah, she pretty much took care of me for the first year of my life. My mother had a whole bunch of kids and a big old house and a husband that did, in those days, well, still to this day, sad to say, but especially in those days, men did nothing as far as helping with household chores. So my mom was pretty frazzled, and as I said earlier, just didn't seem that happy. And, my oldest sister took care of me. I know when I had my own kids, I was hyper aware of how important it was to bond with your kid right from the get-go. That the first month of life is more important than the second month of life, which is more important than the third month, which is more important than the fourth month. I mean, the earliest months and years of a child's life are so important in establishing those bonds of love and creating confidence and character that will last a lifetime. I was hyper aware of this as a new parent, and I read all the books, and I arranged my life around my kids, and I was going to be sure to provide them with what they needed in those early months and years. And then to find out that my sister Mary was really the primary caregiver my first year was kind of a profound thing to learn. And I love my sister. And to discover the truth of my first year of life and the fact that she was the one who provided that. Yeah, a profound discovery, to say the least. My earliest memories really don't include my siblings, which is kind of an odd thing to say since there was a whole house full of them. I had 6 older brothers and sisters. We must have been on top of each other all the time, but honestly, my earliest memories don't really include them that much. It's after a few years that my brother James and I become close, and we're kind of buddies, and we're hanging out. But no, those early memories, no. It's my parents and my scary grandparents doing the things that little kids do. Walk around on all fours, pretend to be a dog. I think I did that for months at a time. Climbing in and out of cupboards. Those kind of classic early memories. The house itself, the yard, the dirt along the edge of the pathway where I'd roll my little toy trucks. I imagine if I went to a shrink, they might be able to help me discover why this is the case. But my very earliest memories, I might as well have been an only child. I can't figure that one out. I don't know the answer to that. Well, let's call it a day. You've been listening to episode 2 of my Untitled Memoir. If I decide there's going to be an episode 3 and then an episode 4 and 5 and 6, and we'll see how long it goes. If I decide there's going to be another episode, it will be a separate podcast with its own title. We won't do it again here on the log. But if it does continue, we'll do it as its own separate podcast, and I'll tell you where to find it if you're interested in this sort of thing. All right, there it is. Thanks for listening. I'm Peter Donalds, a.k.a. Charles Purcell.